In certain parts of Alabama in 1919, the night still belonged to something, not to the sheriff, not to the preacher, not to the richest man in the county. It belonged to distance. It belonged to the dirt road that turned to soup when it rained, to the low places that swallowed a wagon wheel, to the cold that slipped through gaps in boards that never fit tight. Out there, night was something you crossed, if you could, and not everyone had the right to cross it. The ones who did were usually working people. You could tell how well a family was doing just by the sound of their house. A good house had a steady kind of quiet, boards nailed right, hinges that didn't complain. A poor house had coughing, pots clanking, children crying early. But when it was time for someone to be born, even the good houses turned back into what they really were: wood and fear. Nobody could buy their way out of that. The body doesn't care about a last name. Back then, the word hospital existed, sure. There was a hospital in the bigger town, maybe 2 or 3 hours away on a good day, with a strong horse, no busted tire, and no washed-out bridge. But hospitals weren't for everybody, not by money. And not by habit. The countryside was stubborn because it had to be. If life had always happened at home, then home was where it started and where it ended. A doctor came when he came, and when he did, he charged, he gave orders, and he left. A doctor didn't stay to wash the dirty sheets. He didn't stay to calm a drunk husband. He didn't stay to hold the hand of a woman who'd already delivered 4 and was sure this time she wouldn't come back. That's why there was a midwife. That word carried weight where she lived. It wasn't a pretty title. It was a job. Like blacksmith, like gravedigger. You didn't call for one because you felt like it. You called because you needed it. A midwife was the woman who walked in without apologizing when everybody else in the house had already lost their composure. She stepped into that room the way you step into a place where the truth isn't allowed to walk back out afterward, and she stepped out the same way, carrying a piece of other people's lives in a plain cloth bag. You understood her work best by what you didn't see. Folks didn't talk about midwives on front porches or after church. The community knew they existed, knew who was good and who was dangerous, but they didn't talk. If a woman needed a midwife, it meant the doctor was too far, too expensive, or too risky to call without becoming conversation. Country people have a kind of respect that can look like coldness from the outside, but it's just self-protection. Nobody wanted to be remembered for the worst night inside their own walls. The rules came before any manual or official paper. The first one was simple: discretion. You didn't repeat what you saw. You didn't pass along what you heard. You could cross the road in the dark, but you didn't cross your tongue in daylight. The second rule was, don't make a scene, even when things went wrong. And sometimes they did, because 1919 was still the kind of world where plenty went wrong. A midwife who got loud lost what mattered most: the chance to be called again. And the third rule, the hardest one, was this: a midwife didn't just work with blood and pain. She worked with shame. Shame was old currency. In some doors, it spent better than cash. Shame decided who came in the front and who slipped around back, who could ask for help, and who had to act like they never needed any. It even decided what hour the call came. A family that thought of itself as respectable would rather wait late, too late, until there was no choice, because choice meant admitting something, and admitting something meant losing control of the story. And in that Alabama in 1919, there was something else in the air, too. Change. Not the kind you read about in school books with a date stamped on it. Country change. Slow. Resisted. Creeping. The war had ended the year before. Some boys came back with different eyes. Some didn't come back at all, and when you lose men, the place looks the same, but the talk shifts. On top of that, there was still the memory of sickness, fever, influenza, death that came through like weather and took people without asking. When death passes close, birth turns serious. Nobody wanted to lose a mother and a baby in the same month. In that setting, the midwife was a kind of balance, not a saint, not a carnival healer, a worker, and like any worker, she carried tools. Only her tools were simple, and they depended more on habit than on luxury. Clean cloth, soap, thread, scissors, a basin, sometimes a bottle of alcohol if somebody had it. The rest was a cool head, steady hands, and the rare ability to stay present while everyone around her was drifting out of themselves. She also carried something that didn't fit in her bag, her name. That's what held the work together, because if a midwife lost her name, it didn't matter how good her hands were. Folks stopped calling, and in a place like that, thought it not being called wasn't just losing income. It was losing your place in the world, not because she enjoyed being needed, but because work is what gave shape to time. Country people understood that. Dignity came from service done right, not from speeches. That's the world where the name Evelyn May Carter took root. I didn't know Evelyn in her prime. By the time I was a boy, she was already one of those figures that sits at the edge of your memory like an old fence post. Nobody remembers when it went up, but everybody knows exactly where it is. I grew up hearing her name said low, half respect, half caution. And when a name is spoken like that, you learn something. The person carrying it has carried too much. Evelyn wasn't a town woman. She belonged to the country the way dust belongs to your boots. She was in her early 50s in 1919, and she had a way of standing that made it look like she was always headed somewhere, even when she wasn't moving. People like that don't explain themselves. They show up when they're needed and slip out before anyone asks too much. The county she worked in was stitched together by fences, fields, and scattered houses. Some built sturdy, some built tired. There were families that ran things and families that endured. People with land and people with only their hands. There was the church, which was more than faith. It was court, stage, measuring stick. And in the middle of all that were women holding the world up without anyone calling it a world. They called it the day. When the time came, news traveled the old way, mouth to mouth. Boys running, men riding, a neighbor clapping at a gate, and the call for a midwife carried its own kind of urgency, because it was urgency trying not to become scandal. A messenger often didn't say the whole sentence. He'd just say, "It's time," or "She needs you." Sometimes he wouldn't even say a name, afraid someone might hear. Evelyn understood those codes. She could tell the difference between someone asking for help and someone asking for silence. And she knew that in that time and place, help and silence usually came bundled together. What people from outside don't always understand is that a midwife's first work didn't start in the bedroom. It started before that, on the road. It started the moment she decided to leave her house when the night had already swallowed the lane. It started crossing a narrow bridge with water running underneath, cutting through a stretch where the brush stood waist-high, hearing a dog bark and knowing whether it was warning or threat. That was the real world of the job. The delivery itself was just where everything came to a point. That's why I say the night had an owner, because when Evelyn May Carter stepped out, she stepped into a world where nobody held full control. Out there, fate was made of footsteps, mud, wind, and prayers said without sound. And every house she reached was a story that could end in relief or end in loss. Early in 1919, her name was still spoken with respect, but there were signs, small, almost invisible, that the world was beginning to tighten around her kind of work. Talk about proper records, about doing it the right way, about city folks wanting to organize what had always been handled by human hands. It didn't arrive with flags. It arrived as a note, a counter-rumor, a look that lingered a little too long on her cloth bag. And when an old world starts getting measured by new rules, the people living in the old world feel it first. It was in that time, Alabama dirt roads and heavy on her, that the night happened. The night I never saw, but heard about in pieces for years. A night when Evelyn was called not the way she was usually called, not at the gate, not out front, not with her name spoken plain. That night, they called for her the way you call for someone when you're trying to make a mistake without witnesses. And that's where her story, once about routine and service, started to become something else. Before I talk about that night itself, I have to talk about the kind of woman who can walk into a night like that and not show fear on her face. Because a house might call a midwife out of desperation, but a house only calls a midwife the way you call for a mistake with no witnesses, when they believe she'll understand what's being asked. Evelyn May Carter understood. She wasn't born with a name that heavy. Nobody is. A name becomes heavy when you live long enough without breaking. Evelyn was born around 1867, when that part of the country was still patching itself back together from things people didn't say out loud. She grew up on land where men talked about crops and women talked about food, but everyone knew who actually held the house upright when it mattered. She learned early how to watch and keep quiet. In the country, watching and keeping quiet is half of wisdom. Evelyn didn't have schooling the way town folks picture schooling. She had a working education. She learned to read enough not to get cheated at the counter, and to recognize her own name on paper, and around there that was already something. But the real learning came from another woman, older, harder, the kind of woman who didn't soften herself or anybody, because life never softened for her. That woman's name got lost in the telling over the years, and maybe that's fitting. Old-time midwives were like that. They did what needed doing, then let the world move on. What stayed behind was the trace. Training didn't come with a certificate. It came with repetition. First you boil water, then you fold cloth, then you hold a lantern in the corner, and learn not to faint at what you see. Then you learn when a woman needs nothing but quiet, and when she needs somebody to speak firm to her, because deep pain can scatter even a strong mind. And little by little, the older woman lets you put your hands where it counts, not as kindness, but because the work demands it. That's how a trade is born when the city doesn't reach you. By the time Evelyn started going out on her own, she was still young, but not so young she believed the world was fair. And she never tried to be anything but what she was, a working woman. She didn't have that sweet way some people use to keep everybody comfortable. What she had was steadiness. She came when she was called. She did what she knew. She left without asking for thanks. And in a place like that, steadiness is worth more than charm. The first time I heard about her, it was the way you hear about someone who solves problems. Send for Evelyn. People said it like you'd send for a blacksmith to fix a broken axle. And, in a plain way, that's what it was. Something had gone off course in the body, and she came to set it back on the right path. But unlike a blacksmith, she worked with living people, and living people hold grudges, hold shame, hold fear. One story I heard as a boy was about a hard rain, the kind that turns a road into a river of mud. A man rode up to her place, soaked through, not even taking off his hat. He didn't beg. He just said, "It's over toward Pine Hollow. She's gone weak." Evelyn didn't ask whose wife it was. She didn't ask what anybody was hiding. She took her bag, pulled on a shawl, and went. Folks said she crossed a bridge that was already leaning, with water slapping the supports. They said the horse slipped, and she didn't go down. I can't tell you what part of that got polished in the retelling, but I know what matters. When she got there, the woman was near the edge, and the baby was coming wrong. It was the kind of case where people prayed and waited for the worst. Evelyn didn't wait. She worked quiet and steady, because panic doesn't help anybody. By morning, there was a baby crying, and there was a mother breathing, and after that, her name got harder to attack. But reputation in the country isn't built only on what you save. It's built on how you carry yourself when something goes wrong. And yes, sometimes it did go wrong. Not because Evelyn was careless, but because 1919 was still a world of infection, fever, bleeding that came without warning, labor that stalled, homes that weren't clean, water that wasn't good. When there was a loss, Evelyn didn't make a show of it. She didn't stand on the porch explaining herself to whoever wanted a story. She did what needed doing, lowered her head, and left with the same bag, only heavier. And then the next day, she'd walk right back out to another call. That, too, built her name. She didn't run from the work because she feared judgment. She charged the old way. Cash if there was any, flour if there wasn't. Sometimes a piece of cloth, sometimes a chicken tied by the legs. More than once I heard she refused payment when a house was truly down to nothing. That wasn't sainthood. That was a kind of moral arithmetic. Evelyn knew that if you shame a family when they're already broken, folks don't forget. And if they don't forget, you lose doors lose roads, lose your future. She helped because it was her job, but also because she understood how to live among people. Her code was plain, and that's why it could be dangerous. Evelyn believed that when a baby was coming, there were only two things that truly mattered: life and dignity. And by dignity, I don't mean pride dressed up nice. I mean the simple ability to live with yourself afterward. She hated humiliation. She hated a man barking orders at a woman while pain was tearing through her. She hated neighbors drifting into the room like it was entertainment. When Evelyn arrived, she shut the door and made the world wait outside. But there was one line in her code that was stone. Evelyn hated a lie on paper. She could keep a secret with a closed mouth. She could pretend she hadn't noticed certain things if it meant not blowing a family apart. But she had an old, deep refusal to put her name under something false in writing. Maybe she grew up watching people get trapped by contracts they couldn't read. Maybe she'd seen how paper becomes a weapon when somebody with power decides to swing it. She knew words can drift away, but paper stays, and paper ends up in the pockets of men who run things. Around that time, you started hearing more talk about doing things the town way. It wasn't a clear law sitting on the table yet, but it was a shadow moving across the county. Talk of birth records, proper names, cleanliness, training, oversight. Sometimes a public health nurse would come through with a clipboard, writing things down and looking at homes like she was counting floors. And sometimes a young doctor, newly minted, would show up wanting to prove modern ways belonged everywhere. Evelyn didn't fight any of that in the street. She didn't enjoy a public quarrel. She just didn't bend easy. The countryside teaches a person something simple. What's good proves itself. What's new makes promises. And promises, out there, aren't worth much until they hold up under mud and night. Then there were the church rules, the unspoken ones. A midwife had to walk a thin line. If folks saw her tied to scandal, an affair, a pregnancy that didn't fit the calendar, a bruise nobody explained, she became the woman who knows too much. And when a community gets nervous about what you know, it tries to push you out of sight. Evelyn understood that, and she still went when she was called. She went the way she always went. Steady, private, and not impressed by anybody's last name. That alone was a kind of courage. No speeches, no hero talk, just presence. And it was because of that exact mix, capable hands and a shut mouth, a hard shell, and a strict line she wouldn't cross, that in 1919 somebody decided she was the right person for a job that wasn't going to be asked plainly. The messenger didn't come up to her gate like the others did. He didn't clap at the fence. He didn't speak her name loud. He showed up like a man who didn't want to be remembered. And when Evelyn saw him standing in the dark, she understood before he said much. This wasn't just work. This was a house trying to control its story, and choosing her as the tool. And when a community chooses you to carry what it refuses to carry, life stops being just a job. It becomes a test. He showed up without the sound of a horse. That alone was strange. In that part of the county, a man who came for a midwife usually rode hard or ran hard. He arrived out of breath, hat in his hands, voice raised, not from disrespect, but because panic doesn't know how to whisper. This man didn't come like that. He stood there like a shadow leaned against the fence, just outside the weak reach of Evelyn's porch lantern. When she opened the door, he didn't step forward. He stayed put, like moving closer would leave a trail. Evelyn looked at him the way she looked at everything, without hurry. She was a small woman, but she had the kind of presence that makes people straighten up inside themselves. Even in the dark, her voice came out clean. "Who is it?" He worked his hat in his hands, like the thing was a piece of guilt. "I came to get you," he said. It's time." He didn't say the woman's name, didn't say the road, didn't say the house, just, "It's time." That wasn't normal. In the country, when someone avoids names, it's because the name has weight. Evelyn didn't ask a string of questions on the porch. A porch is where ears live. She took her cloth bag off the hook, the same bag that had gone into so many nights, and pulled a shawl over her shoulders. Before stepping down, she looked at him again. "Where?" He hesitated, brief but real, as if the word cost him. "Near Cedar Creek. But there's a better way. We go in through the back, through the back. That wasn't just directions. It was a request to be invisible. A house that has a back way to use usually has a front it wants the world to see. And a house that asks a midwife to come in the back is a house that doesn't want anybody knowing it needed a midwife. Evelyn closed her door carefully. No loud latch. No sharp sound. Discretion was in her bones. But there's a difference between discretion and caution, and that night had caution in it. The man didn't talk much on the way. He didn't bring a horse for her. He had a small buggy, simple but kept up, the kind of rig you didn't take through deep mud. That told its own story. Poor folks don't choose their roads. The well-off do. He guided them away from the main track, taking lesser-used cuts through the trees. It felt like they were steering around eyes. The sky was clear, but the moon wasn't doing anybody favors. Out there, darkness took what it wanted. The pines leaned over the path, and the soft squeak of the wheels sounded too loud. At one point, they passed near a house where a lamp still burned. The man pulled the reins and waited, quiet, until the light was behind them. Evelyn didn't say anything, but I can imagine the thought. If this was only about birth, nobody would waste time like that. This wasn't just urgency. This was urgency wrapped in reputation. They reached Cedar Creek without ever going through the center of town. That was a choice. And when people start making choices in the middle of an emergency, it means they're managing more than pain. The house sat back among the trees, big enough to have a wide porch and window curtains. Not a mansion, but a landowner's house, a house that sat closer to the front of the church, a house that loaned money and didn't ask twice. They didn't stop out front. The buggy circled to the side and rolled around back to a smaller door. The light was thin there, and the smell was stable and damp wood. A woman waited at the back steps, wrapped in a dark shawl, hair pinned up in a hurry. Her face was made of urgency and fear. She didn't greet Evelyn the usual way. No, thank God. No, I'm grateful you came. She said one thing. Back here. Quick. Evelyn stepped inside. The inside of that house was too quiet for a house with a woman in labor. In poor homes, labor filled the air with voices. Neighbors, aunts, children crying because nobody was paying attention. In respectable homes, there could be quiet, but this quiet had a different weight. It was ordered quiet. Disciplined, like someone had told the whole house to keep its mouth shut. They led Evelyn down a hall, where even the furniture looked protected, covered with cloth like they didn't want the room itself touched by what was happening. In the corridor stood a man with his hat in his hands, face set hard, like he didn't know whether he was angry or ashamed. He looked away when he saw Evelyn, like she was evidence. Evelyn didn't lower her eyes. She walked on. In the bedroom, the woman in labor lay on the bed with a sheet pulled up to her chest. Her face was slick with sweat and pale, and her eyes had that far-off look of someone trying not to get lost inside pain. She was young, and she had the kind of prettiness the country calls well-kept. That was another odd thing, a well-kept young woman in a good house, calling for a midwife through the back door. Evelyn's first job wasn't to touch, it was to see. She scanned the room, the corner where water warmed, the stack of folded cloth, the lamp. Everything was arranged too neatly, too clean, like somebody had staged the scene. When she took the young woman's pulse, the skin felt cold, and there was a faint trembling. The body was fighting hard. The young woman gripped Evelyn's hand with surprising strength, and for a second, the respectable house mask cracked. She whispered, barely voice at all, Don't let them hear me." Evelyn leaned in. "Who?" The woman didn't answer. She just shut her eyes and swallowed a sound. That was when the woman in the dark shawl, the one who'd brought Evelyn in, moved closer like she was there to give instructions. She spoke softly, but there was steel in it. "You do your work," she said, "and then we'll take care of the rest. Take care of the rest." Midwives weren't called to take care of the rest. A midwife was called to bring a child through and keep a mother alive. The rest only shows up when someone is already planning a story. Evelyn didn't argue. Not in that room. Not in that hour. The body on that bed didn't have time for moral debates. She did what she always did. Washed her hands with soap. Asked for more hot water. asked for clean cloth. She told them to clear the room of anybody who didn't need to be there. The shawled woman looked offended for a moment, but she obeyed. The man in the hall stayed outside, one hand on the doorknob, like he wanted in and wasn't allowed. Evelyn worked in steady silence. The labor was far along, but something wasn't lining up. It wasn't just fatigue. There was a nervousness around the house, a strange hurry, like they were trying to force time to move differently. Evelyn felt it the way you feel a shift in the wind. And then, during a brief moment when the young woman clenched and the shawled woman stepped away to fetch more cloth, Evelyn saw the detail that changed the whole night. On a chair near the bed, there were baby clothes already laid out, but not the rushed kind you throw together last minute. These were the kind you prepare ahead of time, and beside them, folded neatly, sat a piece of paper with names written on it. 2 names, like someone had decided the story before the child ever drew breath. Evelyn didn't pick up the paper. She didn't need to. She only had to see it, and what she saw told her enough. This house wasn't just waiting on a birth. It was preparing a version. That's when the first wrong turn showed itself fully. It wasn't only calling a midwife in secret. It was calling a midwife in secret with a purpose, to control what would be said later, what would be written later, what would be remembered later. Evelyn kept working, because the young woman's body wasn't waiting for anyone's judgment. But inside, she had already stepped into another kind of night. She knew that when this was over, someone would ask her for more than steady hands. They were going to ask her to lend her name to an agreement. And in the country, when they ask that of someone like Evelyn May Carter, they aren't asking for a favor. They're testing her code. Evelyn wasn't the kind of woman who got dazzled by money, but she could feel the weight of a house the moment she stepped inside. And that night, the weight didn't come from the furniture or the size of the porch. It came from the way people breathed. Every step in that hallway felt measured. Every word sounded chosen, so nothing spilled over. It was like everyone in that place was trying to keep reality inside a narrow frame, pressing the edges with their hands. Labor didn't care about any of that. The young woman let out one cry, not loud, but enough for the truth to slip out, and the woman in the dark shawl jerked the door open, like she'd been yanked by a rope. Evelyn lifted her eyes and, without raising her voice, spoke in the tone of someone who isn't asking. "Close the door, and nobody comes in here unless I call them." The shawled woman hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because she wasn't used to being told what to do inside that house. Still, she shut it. The click of the latch sounded like an agreement made against somebody's pride. Evelyn turned back to the bed. She didn't waste time on comfort words. This wasn't a moment for speeches. It was a moment for presence. She coached breathing, shifted the woman's position, asked for cloth and hot water. The labor pushed forward in fits, like the body itself was wrestling fear. Evelyn saw what the others didn't want to admit. This girl wasn't only in pain, she was terrified of who might hear her. That's where the night showed its first teeth. Between contractions, when the woman's mind seemed to drift for a second, she grabbed Evelyn's forearm with surprising strength and whispered, "He can't know. Not like this." Evelyn didn't ask who, not because she didn't care, but because sometimes a question is a shove toward the edge. She answered low and steady, "Stay with me. The rest stays outside." It was a promise, and it was also a boundary. Evelyn could control that room. She couldn't control what waited in the hall. And in that house, the hall was made of interests. When the baby finally came, it didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with the kind of silence that comes before judgment. Evelyn caught the child, cleared what needed clearing, did what was done, and waited for the one sound that mattered most, the first cry. When it came, it was thin, but it came. The young mother's face broke open, not into pure joy, but into desperate relief, like she'd crawled back from a dark place. For a few minutes, it was just work. Evelyn checked the mother, handled the cord, folded cloth, kept things moving. In another house, that would have been the end of it. A hard night, but still inside the job. In that house, it was only the beginning. The door opened again, just a crack. The shawled woman slipped in like she was stepping into court, and behind her came the man from the hallway. He wasn't old, but he carried himself like someone who learned early that he could make others bend. His eyes swept over the baby like he was assessing something fragile that still had to fit a plan. Evelyn shifted her body between them and the bed without turning it into a show, just a simple placement, a line drawn without words. "She needs rest," Evelyn said, "and the baby needs warmth." The man didn't answer right away. He looked at the shawled woman, then back at Evelyn. Then he spoke in a low voice that sounded polite on the surface. "You did good work." It wasn't praise. It was marking territory. The shawled woman moved to a small table and picked up the folded paper Evelyn had seen earlier. She didn't open it in front of Evelyn. Not yet. She just held it like a blade kept behind cloth. "You know how we do this," she said. "We're going to need to get the record right. No trouble." Evelyn felt that old heat rise in her chest. The record, paper talk, the kind that doesn't blow away. "I don't deal in trouble," Evelyn said. "I deal in what happened." The man took a small step forward. Small, but enough to claim more space. "What happened here stays here," he said, as if he were offering protection. "You understand that?" Evelyn understood. Understanding wasn't the same as agreeing. She looked at the young mother on the bed. Her eyes were closed, but one hand still clenched the sheet, like she was fighting, even in rest. Evelyn had seen that look before in other homes. A woman surrounded by people who said they wanted her safe, but wanted the family story even safer. Evelyn looked back at the man. "I understand silence," she said. "Always have. But silence isn't the same as a lie in writing." The shawled woman tightened her grip on the paper. You could hear it crinkle, small sound, sharp as a match strike. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," she said. Evelyn kept her voice even. "The only people making it bigger are the ones who brought paper into the room before the baby was born." The man went still. That was the closest Evelyn came to a direct challenge that night, and she knew it. She also knew something else. When you say a plain truth to people who are used to controlling everything, they hear it as disrespect. He leaned in slightly, like he was offering a private word. "You've got a good name in this county," he said. "It'd be a shame." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. In a small place, an unfinished threat lands harder than a finished one. That half line was the moment the night stopped being just a night and became the start of a bill coming due. Evelyn took a slow breath, not from fear, but from calculation. She knew the size of the world she lived in. She knew that arguing right there could mean she wouldn't make it home. And she knew that giving in could mean she'd die inside and take her hard-earned name with her. So she did what people often do when there's a newborn breathing in the room. She delayed the fight without handing over her soul. "Not now," she said. "Right now I'm caring for her. Paper can wait." The man stared at her a beat too long. Then he nodded once. "Tight. Paper will wait," he said, "but it won't disappear." And he walked out. The shawled woman stayed one more second, looking at Evelyn as if she were memorizing her face for later use. Then she followed him, taking the paper with her. Evelyn stayed with the mother and the baby. She did what needed doing with the same skill she always had. Checked bleeding, settled the child against the mother, arranged the cloth. In most places, that would have been the end. But in that house, the end was waiting outside the room. When Evelyn finally left through the back door, the sky was already shifting toward gray, the kind of dawn that promises daylight without promising kindness. The buggy was ready. The messenger who'd brought her wasn't the same nervous man from before. Now he was quiet, face shut down, like he'd been given instructions too. On the way back, nobody spoke, and sometimes the silence on the return trip is heavier than the silence going in, because now it's loaded with consequence. For the next few days, the county looked the same from the outside. People went to church. Boys ran the road. The store opened its doors. But Evelyn started noticing small changes, the kind you can't point at, but you feel. A look that slid away too fast, a conversation that stopped when she stepped close, a neighbor who used to call her name now only nodded from a distance. Then came the first message. It didn't come straight from the man in the good house. It came through the store, the way things often do. A man who sold kerosene and flour. One of those men who knew everything and said little, leaned close to Evelyn at the counter while pretending to count change and spoke like he was talking about the weather. "They're saying folks are going to be looking at birth records," he said. "They want everything proper now. Names, dates, all that." Evelyn didn't answer. She took what she'd bought and walked out. But when a rumor reaches you in that tone, it isn't a rumor. It's a warning. That afternoon she understood what was really happening. That house didn't only want her silence about a night. They wanted her name as a stamp on a convenient story. And if she didn't give it, they had ways to turn the whole county against her. The pressure wasn't going to come with shouting or a gun in someone's hand. It was going to come the way the countryside punishes, with doors quietly closing, with work drying up, with a reputation eaten away by whispers. Evelyn had always lived by being called. Now she felt the first tightening in her chest. The truth every working person learns sooner or later. When the work changes, it's not because the need went away. It's because somebody decided you should pay for not obeying. And that folded piece of paper in the shawled woman's hand hadn't disappeared. It was waiting for the right moment to become a weapon. About a week after that night, Evelyn May Carter got called across the creek to a poor house, one of those places that didn't even have a back way to hide anybody. She delivered the baby, took a small sack of flour and a piece of salt meat, and came home bone-tired, with her mind still turning. It was the kind of routine that kept the world in place. But toward sundown, when the light was low, and the dust on the road turned gold in the air, a car pulled up near her fence. A car out there wasn't common. Most folks still had a horse or a buggy. A car meant money, and it meant intention. Evelyn saw the shine of the fender before she saw the man. He stepped out with his tie still straight, like he was headed into a meeting, not onto a piece of land with hard-packed dirt. He took off his hat, polite on the surface. He wasn't the man from the hallway, but he was cut from the same cloth, well-dressed, well-practiced, calm in a way that didn't come from kindness. It came from power. "Mrs. Carter," he said, using her last name like he was gripping a lever. "I came to talk." Evelyn didn't invite him inside. She didn't chase him off either. She stayed on the porch, hands still smelling faintly of soap. "We can talk right here," she said. He nodded, like he'd expected that. He pulled an envelope from the inside pocket of his coat, but he didn't hand it over yet. He just held it. "You were at the Whitmore place last week." The name hit the air like a stone dropped in shallow water. Whitmore was a known name. Good land, front row folks at church, enough reach to make a small story big, or make a big one disappear. Evelyn didn't deny it. Denying would have been childish. "I was," she said. The man opened the envelope and slid out a sheet of paper. It wasn't an official document with a big seal, but it was good paper, neat handwriting, lines laid out clean. It was, in their way, an attempt to make what they wanted feel unavoidable. "You know, people are starting to want everything recorded proper these days," he said, like he was stating the weather. "Name, date, place, all of it. Mr. Whitmore wants to avoid confusion." Evelyn looked at the paper. A name was already written across the top. A date, too, only it wasn't the date of the night she'd been there. And there was a blank space for a signature. That blank space was the real message. He held the paper out with a pen. "We just need you to confirm it. That's all. That's all." That's how powerful people always shrink a heavy thing into a small thing. A man who runs things knows how to turn sin into a gesture. Evelyn felt that old heat rise, something she'd carried since she was young. Paper as a trap, records as a fence. She could sign and step back inside, wash her hands, sleep, and the world would keep turning like it always had, and nobody would truly thank her. People like that didn't thank. They simply took what they believed they had the right to take. But there was the other side, the side that hurt more because it was real. She thought of the young woman on the bed, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd whispered, "He can't know." Evelyn didn't know every detail. Nobody ever does. But she knew enough to understand that girl was being crushed under a story that wasn't hers. And there was the dilemma. It wasn't just lie or don't lie. It was deciding who would get hurt. If Evelyn signed, she might keep that young mother alive inside that house, alive socially, alive in her marriage, alive in whatever place they'd decided she was allowed to have. Maybe. And at the same time, Evelyn would be handing her own name over to a lie that would harden into stone and follow her the rest of her life. If she refused, she might destroy that woman and the baby inside a community that didn't forgive a stain once it could be pointed at, because in the country, the worst sin wasn't making a mistake. The worst sin was being found out. The man saw the hesitation and took it as an opening. He eased the pen closer, as if he were being helpful. Mrs. Carter, nobody's asking you to do anything wrong. Just adjust what needs adjusting for everybody's sake. For everybody's sake is what men say when they mean, for my name. Evelyn stared at the tip of the pen. It was just a small point of metal, but in that moment, it looked like a blade. That's not the day, she said. His brow tightened, not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't like it. Excuse me? The day of the birth isn't that day, Evelyn said. I don't put my name under a day that didn't happen. The man drew in a breath and looked off toward the road, like he was holding his temper in with manners. You're making this harder than it needs to be. It's not me, Evelyn said. I'm just telling the truth. He slid the pen away slow, like he was changing tools. And that's when the way the world really worked, what you might call the documentary truth of it, showed itself plain. You know they're starting to look at midwives now, he said, and his voice lost its polite coating. Talk about training, about registration, about licenses. There are folks who don't like the old ways, and when they start asking questions, you're going to want to be on the right side of it. Evelyn understood exactly what he was doing. This wasn't only the Whitmores' problem anymore. This was about whether Evelyn would be allowed to keep being Evelyn, because in a time when the world was starting to organize life, a woman like her lived on something fragile: public trust. If they planted doubt about her, it would only take a breath, only a whisper that she fixes papers, that she does things in secret, that she goes in respectable houses through the back, and the same county that respected her would learn to avoid her. The man stepped closer, tightening the space between them. He kept his voice low, but the threat was complete. Mr. Whitmore has friends, he said. Friends who ask questions. Friends who decide who gets to work and who doesn't. You understand? Evelyn looked at him without rushing. When I say she was calm, I don't mean she was fearless. I mean she was tired of being pushed. I understand, she said, but I don't sell my name. He stood there a long moment. In the background, inside Evelyn's house, a kettle began to hiss. Small domestic sound, like the world trying to stay ordinary. It made the porch feel even colder. He slid the paper back into the envelope without crumpling it. That mattered. A man who crumples paper is angry. A man who puts it away neat is planning. You're doing this the hard way, he said. Evelyn answered in the same quiet tone, but it didn't ask permission. The easy way usually costs more later. He nodded once, short, like he was filing her refusal away for future use. He put his hat on and walked back to the car. Before he got in, he looked over his shoulder and dropped a line the way you drop a nail in a road. Just so you know, people are saying you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Then he drove off. Evelyn stayed on the porch and watched the dust settle. In most lives, that would have been nothing more than an ugly visit. In Evelyn's life, it was the point you don't come back from. Because now it wasn't just one strange night. It was a quiet fight with people who didn't lose. The next morning, she went into town for kerosene and salt. The storekeeper, the same man who'd warned her about record-keeping, didn't look her in the eye. A woman who used to speak to Evelyn right in the middle of the road crossed to the other side, like the street had turned into a river. Evelyn didn't argue, didn't demand loyalty. She bought what she needed, paid, and walked out. But what the town was doing, those eyes sliding away, those voices lowering, was a kind of sentence, not official. Worse than official. An official sentence you can fight with time and paperwork. A county sentence you carry alone. That night back home, Evelyn opened her bag and washed the cloths from the last delivery. She scrubbed hard, like she was trying to clean more than fabric. The water turned cloudy. She dumped it, filled the basin again, and kept going, and I can see, without ever having been there, the moment she must have paused with her hands in the water and understood that her choice had already been made, even if the full price hadn't arrived yet. Because the point of no return isn't when you choose between right and wrong. It's when you choose which part of you gets to survive. Punishment in a small community rarely comes with shouting. It comes through routine, quietly altered. In the days after the man in the suit coat left her porch, Evelyn May Carter kept waking early, sweeping the boards, boiling water, folding cloth. She did the same things because that's how working people hold the world together, by repeating what still can be repeated. But what had changed wasn't inside her house. It was outside, in the way the county started to breathe when her name got close. First came the strange gaps between calls. A midwife who's used to being sent for can feel it when the air turns cold. Not because she's counting money. Most times there isn't much. But because she knows the pattern of need. In a year like that, babies still came. Women still got scared. Houses still needed somebody. When the work dries up, it isn't because birth stopped. It's because someone decided you shouldn't be invited in. Evelyn waited, and the silence answered. A week without a call, then another. When a call finally came, it was from farther out, poorer, more forgotten. A stretch of road even the preacher didn't visit much. She went, did the work, came back. She took the same kind of payment she always had, but she noticed the difference in that house. Nobody said her name with respect. They said it with need. Respect chooses. Need takes what's left. Not long after, the second kind of consequence showed up. Crooked talk. Evelyn walked into the general store, and a conversation would pause, just long enough to be felt, not long enough to be accused. The store owner stopped asking, "How you doing?" the old friendly way. A woman on the road adjusted her child on her hip and quickened her step. The preacher, who used to greet Evelyn with a steady nod, started nodding from a distance, like standing close might make him responsible for something. In the country, that's how being pushed out begins. Evelyn didn't react the way a younger person might. She didn't go demanding explanations. She didn't knock on doors and ask for loyalty. She was old enough to know forced loyalty turns into humiliation. She just kept living the way she could. But inside, each one of those small moves was a nail driven slow. The third consequence came through the cruelest channel, the people who had once owed her their lives. One afternoon, a woman Evelyn had helped years before, the kind of case where she'd bled too much and would have died if Evelyn had left that room, came to Evelyn's gate with her eyes lowered and her voice squeezed tight. "Evelyn, I needed," she started. Evelyn opened the gate, expecting a call. That would have made sense, but the woman didn't come asking for a birth. She came offering an apology. "I heard some things," she said, and her eyes filled, not with pretty tears, but with shame. "I don't believe it. But my husband, he said it'd be better if we kept our distance, just for a while." Just for a while. Another one of those phrases people use to push you away without admitting cowardice. Evelyn listened without blinking much. Her voice came out even. "All right." The woman reached like she wanted to take Evelyn's hand, like she wanted to keep the bond while cutting it. Evelyn didn't jerk away, but she didn't squeeze back either. It was as if she were saying, "I understand, but I'll remember." After the woman left, Evelyn stood a moment, watching the empty road. And that's when loneliness moves in for real. Not because you have nobody in the world, but because you realize people you saved can deny you to keep their own peace. Meanwhile, that shadow of paper kept circling. It didn't take long for the fourth consequence to arrive, the official visit. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't a courtroom. It was worse than that. Someone from town with a clipboard and an inspecting eye. A public health nurse, one of the kind that started showing up in rural places with talk of cleanliness, training, and record. She came one morning polite, with a practiced smile, and asked to speak about the work. Evelyn kept her on the porch, the same way she'd kept the man in the suit on the porch. The porch was where Evelyn kept her life on her own ground. The nurse talked about new times, about reducing risk, about Standard practices. She said the county wanted to know who the midwives were, where they worked, whether they understood the basics. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She didn't despise care. She despised what was being smuggled in under the word care. When the nurse, soft as a blade, asked whether Evelyn made sure births were recorded properly, Evelyn knew exactly where that question came from. Someone had planted it. "I tell the truth," Evelyn said. "Always have." The nurse wrote something down. Just a pencil line. But that pencil line carried more threat than a gun. Because a gun is visible. A pencil disappears into a system. After the nurse left, Evelyn understood the story had moved out of gossip and into files. And once your name enters a file, you don't control how it travels. The fifth consequence was the quietest and maybe the hardest, the way people started calling her. Before, they called because they trusted her. Now they called in secret, like they were doing something shameful. One night a young man knocked without taking off his hat. His eyes were wide with nerves. "My sister needs you," he said. "But Mama said you shouldn't come in the front. Folks are talking." Evelyn could have refused. She could have demanded dignity. But the girl's body wasn't guilty of anybody's gossip. So Evelyn took her bag and went down the side path through the yard, feeling that humiliation like a stone in her shoe. That's how her work began to turn sad. It wasn't a respected service anymore. It was a tolerated one. She became the woman who came when nobody wanted to see her, the woman who helped and then vanished, the woman needed and at the same time inconvenient. Months went by like that, and the countryside is skilled at making time hurt slowly. Her income fell. Food in Evelyn's house got simpler. She mended clothes more than she bought them. She reused cloth until there was nothing left to reuse. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was life tightening the rope. Then came something that had nothing to do with a delivery and everything to do with the message being sent. One day, Evelyn found her bag had been handled. Nothing valuable was missing. There wasn't much worth taking, but the cloths were disturbed. The scissors were moved. It felt like someone had come in only to leave a note without words. "We can reach you." Evelyn didn't call the sheriff. She knew which kind of men the sheriff listened to first. She simply put everything back in its place and hung the bag on its hook again, like she was claiming her ground. But the message stayed. She started avoiding certain roads at night, not because she'd grown timid, but because she'd grown careful. Carefulness is what keeps working people alive when the world decides you're a problem. It was around then she stopped going to church as often, not because she lost faith, but because she knew the church in that county was also a place where people weighed you. And a midwife with rumor on her back becomes an easy subject in the aisle after service. And then, when you stop showing up, people use your absence as proof. That's how it works. First they shove you out, then they point at the door and say you left. By the end of that year, Evelyn looked like a different woman to the county, not because she changed inside, but because the county decided to rewrite what she was allowed to be. And that's exactly when she was tired, when the rope was already tight, the bigger consequence arrived. The kind you can't fix with honest work. The good house came back because powerful people don't forget refusal. They just wait for the moment when refusal becomes too expensive. And when that moment comes, it doesn't come as a request. It comes as a demand. It happened on a cold morning near the tail end of winter. Evelyn was out in her yard, hanging cloth on the line, when she heard the car. Long before she saw its shine, the engine sound carried across the dirt road with a confidence no horse ever had. She stopped with the cloth still in her hands and watched without hurry, like a woman who already knows certain visits don't bring news. They bring payment. The car stopped outside her fence. The same man in the suit coat stepped out. This time he didn't take his hat off with the same practiced courtesy. His face had the hardness of someone coming to finish a matter. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you." Evelyn didn't move. "He can come here if he wants," she said. The man smiled. but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of smile that warns you. "It won't be here," he said. "It'll be there, and it'd be best if you don't make this bigger than it has to be." Same language as before. In the country, threats get repeated the way prayers do. Evelyn looked at the line of white cloth lifting in the wind, and for a moment, I imagine she thought about the plain life she'd tried to keep. Then she took her shawl, took her bag, out of habit maybe, out of instinct, and got into the car. Men don't talk much when they're driving someone to a place where she has no control. The suit man drove in silence. Evelyn looked at the road, the fields, the fences, counting maybe how the world can be wide and still feel too small for a working woman. The Whitmore house looked the same, clean, arranged, quiet. A good house always seems ready to host authority. This time, Evelyn was brought in through the front. That mattered. It was their way of saying, "Now you come the way we decide." In the sitting room, Mr. Whitmore waited in a chair like a man who'd never needed to rise fast for anything. He was older than Evelyn, but he didn't carry old age as weakness. He had the comfortable heft of someone who ate well and slept with other people locking doors for him. His eyes weren't openly cruel, and sometimes that's what unsettles you most. Clear cruelty is easy to name. Calm cruelty hides inside normal manners. "Mrs. Carter," he said in a mild voice that only belongs to men used to being obeyed. "Sit." Evelyn didn't sit. She stayed standing. It wasn't theater. It was a boundary. "You sent for me," she said. "I came. Speak." Whitmore nodded, almost as if he admired her spine, the way a man admires a tool that doesn't bend. "You know why we're here." Evelyn didn't answer. She let him spend the word. He opened a drawer and took out the paper. The same paper, or one just like it. Same neat handwriting. Same wrong date sitting there like a nail out of place. "You refused," Whitmore said, and that caused discomfort. That was how men like him described a near scandal. "I don't sign lies," Evelyn said. Whitmore tipped his head as if he were talking to a stubborn child. "You're stuck in an old idea of truth," he said, "and I understand. But truth in this world isn't only what happened. Truth is what holds." Evelyn felt heat rise but kept it out of her voice. "What holds with a lie is just rotten lumber," she said. Whitmore let out a short breath, like he was tired of the lesson. "Let's do this simple," he said. You'll sign, and we're done." Evelyn looked at the paper without touching it. "I won't." That was the moment he changed tactics, and the change was as cold as a door closing. Whitmore made a small gesture. The woman in the dark shawl stepped into the room. In daylight, you could see she wasn't hired help. She was family. Sister, sister-in-law, something close. The kind of woman who runs the inside of a house because she knows every weakness in it. She carried a thicker envelope. She set it on the table and slid it toward Evelyn like she was offering a chance. "You don't want to sign because you're afraid for your name," she said. "We understand that. So we're going to take care of your name." Evelyn didn't open it. She only looked. Whitmore spoke the way a man explains land and fences. "You've been having trouble getting work, haven't you?" he asked, like he was showing concern. "And you know people are watching Midwives now. You've heard it. One word from me fixes that. I can make sure you keep working. I can make sure the good houses call you. I can even make sure that clipboard nurse stops showing up at your porch." Evelyn stayed quiet because she recognized what it was. Not help, a collar. "And if I don't sign?" she asked. Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If you don't sign, you lose what you still have," he said, "and you lose it in a way you can't win back. You'll become the subject nobody wants to touch. You'll become the dangerous midwife, the one who fixes things, the one who's part of trouble. And when licenses start coming down, and they will, you'll be alone." The worst part wasn't the threat. It was how accurate it was. Evelyn looked at the envelope again. For the first time, the shawled woman let the mask slip just a fraction. Her impatience showed. "You think you're protecting somebody with your stubbornness?" she asked. "Who are you protecting?" "I'm protecting my name," Evelyn said. The woman gave a small laugh with no joy. "Your name won't feed you when nobody calls," she said. Whitmore lifted a hand to settle her and returned to that mild voice. "Mrs. Carter, let's talk plain. That child needs to be safe. The mother needed to stay alive in her own house. You saw her. You saw the fear. If you don't sign, You could ruin her, and you'll carry that. That line landed like a knife because it hit the one place Evelyn could still be cut, her compassion. And then the whole truth came out, not as confession, but as leverage. Whitmore said it like he was stating a simple fact. The baby isn't the husband's. The room went quiet, not respectable house quiet, but the kind of quiet you feel in a room after someone dies. Evelyn had suspected as much from the first night, but suspicion and confirmation are different weights. Confirmation settles in the bones. And the husband? Evelyn asked, her voice dry. The shawled woman answered like it was a matter of logistics. The husband doesn't ask. The husband needs the story to work. He's a respected man. He can't take public humiliation. And she can't take what would happen inside that house if this becomes the truth. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, not out of weakness, but to keep the picture from flooding her. Now everything fit. The back entrance, the names written before the birth, the girl's fear, the hurry, the organized silence. It wasn't only about protecting a reputation. It was about keeping a woman from becoming a target inside her own walls. Whitmore slid the pen across the table. Sign, he said, and you walk out of here with your life in order. Don't sign, and you'll be the stone that brings this house down. And I promise you, the house falls on the people inside first. That was the true dilemma, not a clean choice between right and wrong, a dirty choice between who suffers. Evelyn stood there, looking at the pen, the paper, the two people speaking about a woman like she was a piece on a board. In that moment, she could feel the real size of the world. A world where powerful men call a lie protection and call refusal violence. When Evelyn finally reached for the pen, it wasn't surrender. It was a decision to carry one guilt, so another, worse cruelty, wouldn't crush someone who had no defense. She took the pen, but before the point touched paper, she looked Whitmore in the eye and said, simple and flat, I'll do this once, one time, and I'll never set foot in this house again. Whitmore nodded, satisfied, like he'd won something fair. Evelyn signed. Her name went down firm, no shaking, because in that instant she chose what part of her would survive, her ability to keep working, to keep showing up where nobody else would, to keep protecting women who didn't have a voice. But when she set the pen down, she knew, and I mean she knew in the body, that something in her name had cracked, and there isn't a signature on earth that puts that back the way it was. After that day at the Whitmore house, Evelyn May Carter went back to her own place, like someone returning from a funeral. There was no body in a box, no hymn at the church, no neighbors bringing food, and still something had been buried. The idea that her work lived outside of power. She kept on working. She had to, and for a while it looked like the agreement had done what they promised. Calls started coming in again. Doors that had gone cold began to open. The clipboard nurse took longer to show up. Talk at the store didn't stop so sharply when Evelyn walked in. A small town is good at pretending something never happened, and when a person with influence decides a subject should die, plenty of folks help bury it, glad to be spared the discomfort. Silence can feel like relief, but it wasn't relief for Evelyn. What changed in her wasn't her skill. Her hands stayed steady, her eyes stayed sharp, her voice stayed low. What changed was something nobody could see. She began carrying the weight of that signature as if there were a stone in her bag, alongside the cloth and soap. She knew she'd done it to keep a worse cruelty from landing. She knew that. But she also knew this. Once you let your name be used that way, the world learns it can ask again. And once the world learns, it tries. Evelyn kept her own word, though. She never went back into the Whitmore house. If they sent for her, she sent word back. There are others. It was a small way of taking a boundary back. Years passed, and what I can tell you now, and I tell it as someone watching an old way of life fade, is that the world changed the way the countryside always changes. Slowly, without ceremony, and then all at once. In the next decade, there were more cars on the road, more nurses with clipboards, more talk of training, more paper laid out on tables. The midwife, who'd once been simple necessity, became an administrative problem. The county started talking about records, about licensing, about safe practice, a fine-sounding phrase that usually means, we want control, and control almost always decides who gets to exist. Evelyn tried to adjust where she could. She wasn't against cleanliness, and she wasn't against better ways. She was against humiliation, so she did what she could, without giving up what she couldn't. She washed her hands. She boiled water. She demanded clean cloth. She kept curious people out of the room. Some younger midwives started going to meetings, sitting through lessons from people who'd never crossed a muddy road at midnight. Evelyn went once or twice, too, because she understood that refusing everything gives them an excuse to take everything. But even when she sat in those rooms and listened to the obvious explained like a new discovery, she kept quiet. The countryside teaches you. You survive by doing what's necessary, not by opening your heart to people who won't hold it gently. Over time, her reputation settled back into what it had always been: capable, discreet, firm, but it never became light again. People who truly knew her could see a distance in her eyes, as if she'd learned not to belong to the community the way she once had, and the community treated her with a careful kind of respect, less the warm respect of gratitude, more the cool respect you give someone who carries a secret you don't want disturbed. As for the young mother and the child, very little was ever said out loud. In the country, truth travels in pieces, never whole. I heard fragments over the years. Folks said the husband accepted the official story because accepting was less painful than admitting humiliation. Folks said the young woman stayed in that house, body present, spirit shrunk down, like so many women who survive inside an arrangement they never chose. And I heard, too, more than once, from different mouths in different years, that the child grew up healthy and left the county as soon as he could. That's common. People born under heavy silence usually go looking for air somewhere else. Evelyn never spoke about it. If someone tried to pull her into it, she ended the talk with 2 words: don't know. In a place like that, don't know often means, I know too much. The last time I heard her name spoken like a living part of town life was many years later, when I was grown and the county already felt different. An old woman at the store said it like she was commenting on the weather. Evelyn don't go out at night anymore. It wasn't criticism, it was recognition. Because the day a midwife stops going out at night is like the day the church bell stops ringing. It means an era is ending. When Evelyn finally stopped, there was no announcement. Midwives don't retire with speeches. They just leave the bag on the hook, and the night finds a new owner. By then, there were more births in town, more folks getting to a hospital, more cars that could make the trip without breaking down. The world decided it didn't need her anymore. But the world always thinks it doesn't need certain people until the day it does. I can't tell you the exact day Evelyn died. In places like that, the death of an old working person doesn't always become a clean record. But I can tell you how she stayed in the county's memory, and that's truer than a date carved into stone. She stayed as a woman who did the work nobody wanted to watch, a woman who stepped into good houses and poor houses with the same steady gait, and who never walked back out telling stories. Yes, there was also the shadow of the Whitmore matter, because a secret that big doesn't disappear. It just changes hands. Here's what I've learned from listening to old folks and watching people come and go. A community doesn't forgive easily when you break its silence, but it doesn't truly love the person who carries its silence either. A community uses, it needs, and then it keeps walking as if everything was normal. Evelyn May Carter carried a lot in her name, and for one afternoon she let that name be used to hold up a lie that protected a woman and a child, and most of all, protected the pride of men who couldn't stand to be seen as weak. I'm not telling this to judge her. I'm telling it because that's the kind of choice women like Evelyn made without applause, and because when a line of work disappears, we tend to forget what it cost on the inside. Sometimes I pass an old road near Cedar Creek and see what's left of certain houses, leaning boards, tall grass, a chimney still standing like a finger pointing up, and I think about how many nights a woman walked that way with a cloth bag on her arm, without anyone putting her name anywhere that mattered. In the end, that's what remains. Not the signature on the paper, not the Whitmore last name, not the church talk. What remains is a plain picture, a working woman coming home before sunrise, rinsing her hands in a basin, hanging cloth on the line, and moving forward as if the world didn't have the right to break what she still needed to be. And if there's any truth that truly holds, any truth that doesn't need paper, it's that